Thank you. Welcome. A few apologies up front. The first is I'm going to break one of my cardinal rules, which is I'm going to read this. Normally I like to do it extemporaneously, but I tried to sort of boil this down to 45 minutes, and there's a lot in here, and so but I commit to you to try to read it engagingly. The second is a blanket apology, a sic erat scriptum, because many of the people I quote are from the early and middle part of the 20th century, and so they generally use the male pronoun. And so just a blanket statement, so I won't have to say every time that that's something I should apologize for. Okay, so let's begin. I chose the title of this talk for a couple of reasons. First, because it sounded kind of sexy to me, by which I mean attention-grabbing. And second, because it sounded kind of sexy to me. And that has a direct bearing on what I'm going to discuss today. Words are like automobiles. They're vehicles we use to carry the meaning of our minds to other minds. However, cars have trunks that are usually spacious enough to carry a fair amount of baggage. Now, I'd like to think that the denotative sense of a word sits in the driver's seat, and the connotative sense is a stowaway, hiding in the trunk. But quite often, the little bugger in the trunk actually climbs out and takes the wheel. Such is the case, I think, with Manifesto. Denotatively, the word comes from the Latin manifestus, which means plainly apprehensible, clear, apparent, evident. A manifesto, then, is a denotatively clear statement on something. But connotatively, there's so much more. I can't hear the word manifesto without thinking of Marx and the other fellow everyone always forgets. The word is a daring, even dangerous connotation to my mind. It's a word of challenge. It's a word of protest. It's a word of revolution. It speaks truth to power. That's only my response. So much baggage for 9 little letters. So I think that the 3 letters that signify the actual subject of this talk carry so much more baggage that I don't know how they pull it together and survive. A-R-T. The connotative baggage that's accrued to that for centuries over so little a word is staggering. Did I say centuries? I should say millennia. Art. What is it? Why is it so quintessentially human? Why is it so dangerous? Why do we evangelicals distrust it so much? How should we evangelicals do it? How should we evangelicals teach it? As to what it is, I like Flannery O'Connor's definition of art. She says art is a word that immediately scares people off as being a little too grand. But all I mean by art is something that is valuable in itself and that works in itself. The basis of art is truth, both in manner and mode. The person who aims after art aims after truth. In the imaginative sense, no more, no less. That's pretty straightforward. And I don't think she's arguing that art is truth. She's placing the onus of art's truthfulness on the person aiming after art. In her view, if that person, the artist, is trying to represent the world as he or she sees it, with all the honesty they're capable of, then they are embracing the kind of imaginative truth. They're approaching the realm of art. However, the source of that imaginative truth is often the very thing that troubles evangelicals. There is a mystery to the process that feels suspect to us. We can comfortably think of art as a noun, as in a work of art. Our museums, theaters, cinemas are full of those. But we can also think of art as a kind of action or process, as in creating art. And no museum can house that because it's a Delphic moment, the how of which is hidden in mystery even from us. The story goes that Laurence Olivier, perhaps the greatest actor in the 20th century, came off stage one night after giving the performance of a lifetime, and his friends found him in his dressing room completely dejected. "Larry," they said to him in surprise, "how can you be so downcast? You've just given the most sublime performance of your career." "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm so depressed, because I don't know how I did it." The author of the Roman-era treatise Perihypsos on the Sublime tries to capture this lightning of the sublime creative moment in a definable bottle and falls short. But he or she does make some interesting observations. Sublime art, the author tells us, elevates itself above the ordinary, and when done right, brings about a loss of rationality, an alienation leading to identification with the creative process of the artist, and a deep emotion mixed with pleasure and exaltation. And I think we would be mistaken if we were to confuse the non-rationality of the sublime moment with irrationality. The one is a mystery, the other just plain crazy. Ansel Adams, the landscape photographer, wrote, "We all move on the fringes of eternity and are sometimes granted vistas through fabric of illusion." You can find this quote on pretty posters, but ironically, they rarely include the rest of it. "Many refuse to admit it," he goes on, "but I feel a mystery exists. There are certain times when on the whisper of the wind there comes a clear and quiet realization that there is indeed a presence in the world, a non-human entity that is not necessarily inhuman. That whisper on the wind is the mystery I'd like to explore today." La Dame du Brasimpoué is perhaps the earliest known detailed, and we might say realistic, representation of the human face. It's 25,000 years old, give or take. And for any young Earth proponents here, let's just say it's really, really old. The question that intrigues me about this is, why did an artist 250 centuries ago decide to sit down and carve for days, weeks, even months on a mammoth's tusk until he or she revealed this, a mobiliary cameo so delicate it fits comfortably in the palm of your hand? We'll never know the answer, but I have to think there existed in this artist a need to reproduce an image that represented beauty. And this human impulse, this need to represent, is the very thing that has troubled us for so many millennia. The book of Exodus tells us that when Aaron threw gold into the fire, the image of a golden calf leapt out, and the people worshipped it. The worship of a representative work of art, idolatry by definition, is anathema in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the antidote seems most often to be a prohibition against creating representative works of art. The image itself apparently is the problem, rather than our unwise veneration of it. You may recall this image from a few years ago. It's purportedly ISIS operatives destroying precious and ancient works of art in the Mosul Museum. Some folks want to argue that the works were just copies, as though that somehow mitigates the intentions of the destroyers. If there's any doubt about their motivations, one need only recall the fate of 82-year-old Khaled al-Assad, the head of antiquities in Palmyra for 50 years. ISIS captured and interrogated him for a month, but he refused to give up the actual location of the hidden antiquities, and so they beheaded him, hung his headless body from a traffic signal, placed his head between his feet, his glasses still on, with a placard that read among his other crimes, "Director of Idolatries." I'm confident we'd all condemn the actions of these radicals without reservation. However, lest we conclude that the impulse to destroy art resides solely in the deranged psyches of Islamic extremists, we would be wise to recall our own Beetlestorm past. The middle of the 16th century, righteous mobs of Protestants decided it was time to cleanse the local churches of Catholic idolatry. This altarpiece at St. Martin's Cathedral in Utrecht is just one example of such zealous fury. The destruction, hidden for 500 years by a false wall, was revealed again in 1919, an all too clear reminder of our own religious genealogy. We too have gone to war, even with our own brothers and sisters, over such things as works of art and what they provoke in us. This idea of the provocative nature of art is at the very heart of Plato's mistrust of imitation that so influences our Western psyches. Of course, Plato added a bit of nuance to the issue in the classical Greek period. He may not have used a sledgehammer, but the results were still far-reaching. Plato uses the term mimesis for artistic representation. His sole concern was with truth, and he saw all kinds of art around him that didn't measure up to his high standards for aletheia. He argued this representation, or mimesis, was a danger, because at best it was deceptively appealing and entertaining. At worst, it was just a plain lie, and yet still appealing. And therein was the greatest danger. If the true form of a thing exists only in the mind of the gods, as Plato concluded, the human representation of that form, as in, say, the chair a carpenter builds, is but an imitation of the ideal form, and therefore one level removed from the truth. A painting, then, of that carpenter's chair is an imitation of an imitation, twice removed from the ideal form, and as such, even more potentially deceptive. And the deceptiveness is the key issue here, because these imitations are so pleasing to observe that they tend to lure the viewer away from the truth and into the adherence to lies. As you can imagine, this opens the arts up to all kinds of suspicion. As an example, Sue Ellen Case, in an article, Classical Drag, the Greek creation of female parts, suggests the Western ideal of classical female beauty was the result of mimesis, the mimesis of men to be precise, but not in the way one might assume. Every spring, virtually all of Athens would turn out to see the plays presented at the great festival of Dionysus. Case suggests that since women were not allowed to perform, that the men who portrayed the roles of women in the plays actually became the ersatz vogue models of their day, and that trend-conscious Greek women rushed out to the local fabric merchants and patterned their fashion and beauty choices on the male portrayal of feminine beauty they'd seen in the plays. Such is the power of celebrity even today. In his Perfect Republic, Plato would have allowed none of this imitative procession of simulacra, and therefore would have banned the plays to prevent their alluringly deceptive imitations, which would themselves be imitated. Those imitations of imitations of imitations would have then been 3 full levels removed from the truth. The philosopher king's nanny state then would protect its citizenry from these soul-polluting deceptions for their own good. He would also ban other types of dangerous art, including certain modes of music that he deemed socially unhealthy. Rap, for instance, would never have made the grade with dear old Plato. In addition to his problem with mimesis in the arts, Plato struggled with the source of the so-called inspiration. According to Greek cosmology, in addition to Apollo and Dionysus, the Greeks had muses, these lower-tier goddesses tasked with indwelling artistic impulses into mortal humans. When the goddesses would inspire artists, a kind of madness would fall upon them. Manike was the Greek term from which we derive manic or mania. The divine madness was the counterpart to trained skill, techne for the Greeks. The difficulty was, how do you tell the difference between the truth and the lie when art comes from the gods, as for instance the Dionysian plays purportedly did? A touchy situation, since you don't want to get on the bad side of a god, especially the Greek gods, who could be a capricious bunch. The delicateness of the issue is multiplied when you understand that this mania of divine madness was also closely associated with what we might call legitimate religious prophecy, an association that would create territorial problems and perhaps even competitive jealousies for generations to come. In our current age, we might discuss Plato's hard-edged dualism of art or lie in the arts, of truth or lie in the arts, as little more than ancient history, were it not for Augustine's thoroughgoing baptism of Plato's system into early Christianity. Among other things, the distrust of mimesis, idolatry in Christian parlance, combined in Augustine with an intense and seemingly unabated shame and self-loathing at what he considered a profoundly misspent youth. As a young man, he attended the Roman spectacles, which were a kind of circus-like cornucopia of various unbridled, often violent or salacious entertainments meant to keep the mob distracted. These Roman spectacles seemingly played a major imaginative role in Augustine's youthful dissipation, and along with Tertullian and other early church writers, he rails against them as deceivers of the elect. Now, I have no more intention of defending Roman spectacles today than I would NASCAR, the NFL, or nudie cuties down on Rosecrans, which are more apt comparisons than actual art. But in the early church, all these get lumped together to support a Platonic position that all unregulated imitative arts are dangerous. The result going into the European Middle Ages is the very strong sense that the mystery of divine madness associated with art needed to be carefully controlled by the ecclesiastical hierarchy, so that when art is allowed to happen, the right results were achieved, the proper messages conveyed. This dogma demands that we be absolutely sure where the inspiration is coming from before we allow the muse even the slightest entry. And because artistic skill is more trainable and controllable, it is always preferable to the madness of inspiration, which answers to no authority. But try as the ecclesiast might, the process of art has remained stubbornly the same for millennia. because it's a quintessentially human impulse. But the names in the church age were changed to protect the innocent. The Greek techne became the Latin ars, but it means essentially the same thing, skill. The divine madness of the Muses, the Manichae, was far too pagan-seeming and was transformed into the Renaissance notion of invenio, which is not really invention, but more along the lines of discovery, of unveiling, of piercing the veil. It's the genius component of the artistic moment, divine madness by any other name. So even today, we evangelicals usually recognize the R's as the safer component. The word artisan comes from it, and we all like artisanal bread, but we maintain a constant vigilance and skepticism of the invenio. It is, after all, the invenio that usually causes offense both to us as believers and, by extension, to God. When we evangelicals see or read or hear a work of art that breaks the accepted dogma in some way or other, we might think, that art offends me, and by extension, must offend God. And then we stretch this to, that artist offends me, and by extension, must offend God. And if we carry the thought exercise further, we might form the premise, artists and art tend toward offenses against believers and God when given free rein. And therefore we conclude, since being offensive tends toward evil, and evil comes from a demonic seed, aspiring artists must be carefully guided, or they will tend toward evil and become servants of the devil. Now, clearly, this is ad absurdum. Your thought path won't take this course, but I don't think my example is completely off from the mindset of more than a few evangelicals when it comes to art. The only caveat being most evangelicals would add the qualifying term secular to the art that invariably tends toward evil, inferring that sacred art has been mostly purged of such tendencies. I say mostly because we all know that no matter how sacred the art may be deemed, it's always going to offend someone, as evidenced in the fig leaf campaign of the mid-16th century, when at the behest of outraged parishioners, the ecclesiastics agreed to use proverbial fig leaves to cover up the nudity that was so prevalent in Renaissance art. Imagine the statue of David with a fig leaf, hiding his genitals, and you get the picture. Or perhaps the picture is exactly what you're not supposed to get. The point is, in our evangelical communities, we struggle with the tension of how to do art, and by extension, how do we teach art to our young? Part of that question becomes, how do we deal with mimesis and inspiration in ways that are safe and edifying? And frankly, I don't think we always do the best job. We operate very often from a place of guarded sanction rather than honesty. In order to keep our young artists safe, we train them to portray a kind of sanctified reality rather than the authentic one they perceive around them. We teach them to self-censor because it's better for them to be safe than to risk dancing with the devil. But safe standoffishness from our subject cannot produce the art of truth that O'Connor asks of us. We need to be willing to acknowledge our subject in its entirety. We need to have the R's, but also the invenio. We need to teach our young artists to embrace honesty rather than correctness. Or perhaps we need to accept that honesty is the highest form of correctness. And it is possible that honesty will best preach the truth. Frederick Buechner suggests the poets, playwrights, and novelists, in other words, the artists, are the preachers for today. And it's not because they show us the acceptable presence of God in all things, but rather because they are honestly portraying their own sense of the absence of God, and that this absence preaches the gospel better than any pulpit sermon could. For Buechner, telling the truth is telling things the way they are, not necessarily the way they should be. He sees the truth of the gospel as a kind of ongoing cycle play, wherein our story, like nature's great tale of the seasons, begins with the downfall and death, the autumn and winter of the human saga. That part of the cycle, he says, is the tragedy that strips us naked. It is unavoidable and must be, if not embraced, at least acknowledged before we can move on to the comedy of spring. He sees the play King Lear as one of the great preachments of all time. During Shakespeare's 3-hour procession of pain, Lear loses everything: his kingdom, his dignity, his children, his mind, and eventually his life. At the height of his crisis, he wages war with a massive storm. Like Lieutenant Dan strapped to the mast of the Jenny, he has it out with God in the midst of a Category 5 hurricane. According to Forrest, Lieutenant Dan made his peace with God in that particular storm. But there's no such rapprochement for Lear, who enters at the end of the play carrying the lifeless body of the only daughter who actually and honestly loved him, and then dies of grief himself. Edgar provides us with the true benediction. The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. For Buechner, we can't really move on to the comedy of the spring and summer and the ultimate fairy tale of the gospel without acknowledging in our own lives the tragic winter as the necessary precursor. The artists are the real preachers, he tells us, because they portray the uncensored tragedy for what it is. They, like Edgar, speak what they feel, not what they ought to say. This honest view of human weakness imbues the work of the novelist and believer Walker Percy. Percy saw the artist as a kind of canary in the mines, more sensitive to the deep pain and struggles in a society than others. His own experience of life seems cruel. Suicide ran in his family like a congenital defect. One relative overdosed on morphine. Another jumped into a creek with a sugar kettle tied around his neck. His grandfather shot himself. His father carried on the tradition, climbing into the attic of the family home when Walker was 13 and blowing his own head off with a shotgun. After a few years, his mother drove off a bridge and drowned in her car. Miraculously, Percy somehow reached young adulthood without carrying on the morbid tradition and went off to medical school at Columbia University. A happy ending, right? Well, to add insult to already incredible injury, as an intern, Percy contracted tuberculosis from a corpse while performing an autopsy. Never practiced medicine again. Instead, he turned to faith and became a novelist. The main character in most of his novels is often like a shipwrecked castaway who, having found himself washed up on a beach, realizes the ordeal has left him with amnesia. Though he tries then to become an integral part of the island culture, he never feels fully at home. In response to his haunting alienation, he combs the shores of his exile looking for any scrap of a clue that will tell him about his forgotten home across the sea. The Second Coming is a striking example. The despondent and desperate main character, Will Barrett, decides to perform an experiment which will prove once and for all whether God exists and, more importantly, whether he is a loving God. He formulates a plan in which he will crawl deep into a North Carolina cave, take a massive dose of sedatives, and wait for either death to take him or God to reach out from his imperturbable silence and save him. A week later, he's harshly awakened by an excruciating abscessed tooth. He decides that though he came into this cave to force God to appear or die trying, that pain was not a part of his plan and that he must abandon the experiment. God, it seems, has not arrived. Still, in a sedative stupor, he crawls and tumbles out of the cave, damaging himself extensively in the process, and is discovered unconscious and battered by Allie Huger, a young woman who has escaped from a mental institution where she's been undergoing repeated sessions of electroshock therapy that have left her bereft of most of her language skills and all of her memories. She nurses Barrett back to health, and these two broken people, the man with no future and the woman with no past, become one another's salvation. Perhaps God arrived after all. Percy's dark art provides us with very few clear doctrinal answers to our struggles. But he reveals to us a certain grace that may be discovered as we search honestly for answers whilst enduring the pain that is part and parcel of the human journey. He speaks what he feels, not what he ought to say. However, as evangelicals, we are uncomfortable with this notion of unbridled artistic honesty because it may portray the wrong message. Because regardless of the messenger's intent, the message must be correct. It is my opinion that this genealogy of dogmatic rectitude is why we evangelicals so often produce mediocre art. Perhaps I should qualify my statement. I think we produce mediocre art because we burden our artists with the need to exclusively portray some aspect of the holy. Mediocrity is not really bad or good, it is in between. Mediocre is a Latin term identifying the middle, that is, the place between two extremes. So when we describe art as holy because it makes us feel good or has the right message, what we really mean is we've experienced something that doesn't challenge us or offend us or in any way provoke us, and that it somehow worshipfully revalidates our already well-buttressed view of the cosmic order. Is this really a definition of artistic holiness? Is it more accurately a description of holy mediocrity? In reality, it's probably not describing art at all, but a kind of propaganda. That is, a work meant to propagate the articles of faith. Holy mediocrity is the result of forcing inspiration to pass through a filter of dogmatic rectitude. But dogmatic rectitude and artistic honesty are rarely the same thing. To paraphrase O'Connor, art is about everything human, and we are made out of dust. And if you scorn getting yourself dusty, then you shouldn't try to do art. It is with this in mind that I would offer some suggestions to those few brave evangelicals who feel called to the arts, or to parents or educators who are entrusted with rearing and equipping creative children. I make these statements in the style of a manifesto, but I admit that they are still speculative, trial balloons in a sense. I also accept that some of them may not be fully achievable in actual practice. But after decades of struggling in the arts myself, I'd like to think they should be considered. Number one, we need to stop teaching our young artists to self-censor. The creative impulse, the ingenio, to remain creative must be unfettered. I'm aware that this sounds simply too dangerous, but it comes back to the entrenched idea that art is somehow more fraught with peril than other callings, a prejudice I think we should reject. If we train our young artists to self-censor so they won't stumble, we'll also prevent them from ever running. But we want them not only to run, don't we, but to fly. So perhaps we should face the issue head on. Will our young artists stumble if we encourage them to run? Without a doubt. They will stumble and fall, and because they're moving at greater speeds than a crawl, the injuries they sustain will be that much more painful and require that much more recovery. But this is the reality of the human journey. It's a truism that no worthwhile achievement comes without a few scars. The well-trained runners, when they fall, bandage their wounds, get up, and continue running, trying to avoid the pitfalls that tripped them up the last time. It's called growth. But too often, when one of our own does fly and find success or even renown, we honor them, but at arm's length. Because unless their work is clearly sanctified, there is something dangerous about them now. They have stepped outside the norms of the community, and having done so, cannot now be completely trusted. There is in them a dormant virus that might infect others if they are not inoculated. Artists, we think, tread a dangerous path, strewn with rubble of those who have gone before them and been wrecked along the journey. And their flotsam takes the form of so many stumbling blocks that may trip up the unwary pilgrim and take them over the unseen cliff. Therefore, we convince ourselves it's only a kindness to keep our young artists from taking that path. If they never start the journey, then they'll never fall off the cliff. But we may be thinking they're not so much concerned about the artist falling as because they've made their choice after all. We're really concerned about those who view or read or listen or touch or smell the art they produce. They might be caused to stumble by the artist's work. They might be dragged unwittingly over the cliff with the falling artist. But let's face reality here. If as artists we must bear the burden for potential reaction of every person who might partake of our artistic expressions, we may as well never begin, because that's simply impossible. Flannery O'Connor argues, if the writer uses his eyes in the real security of his faith, he will be obliged to use them honestly. To look at the worst will be for him no more than an act of trust in God. But what is one thing for the writer may be another for the reader. What leads the writer to his salvation may lead the reader into sin. And the Catholic writer who looks at this possibility directly looks Medusa in the face and is turned to stone. I wonder, Should Michelangelo be held responsible if someone looks at the Sistine Chapel and is suffused with lust by all the nudity? Or should Tolkien be held responsible if someone reads The Hobbit and goes on a killing spree with a sword? We cannot ask artists to shoulder this responsibility. Artistic vision is a uniquely individual thing, but it's also very fragile and vulnerable, like a flickering candle. Should we snuff out the candle, rendering ourselves blind because we fear the destructive potential of fire? Like so many things in this human walk, the very thing that can light the way through the darkness is the same thing that can burn the house down. So here's what I suggest. Rather than self-censorship, let's teach our young artists honesty. If we don't condition them to self-censor, we must encourage them to be baldly honest, to express their vision exactly as they perceive it. Now let's be clear, I have no doubt that this kind of unbridled honesty will at times offend. But I don't think our honesty will offend God, from whom we can hide nothing anyway. No, the offender will be our brothers and sisters who will question our religious commitment and condemn what they perceive as a poor Christian witness. I'm going to make a C.S. Lewis reference here, knowing that for some, the post-mortem perception of his misogyny categorically disqualifies him from any comment. But relying on that old Appalachian proverb, even a blind pig can find an acorn once in a while, I'll risk it. As far as I'm concerned, one of his most poignant books on faith, A Grief Observed, was published under the pseudonym N.W. Clerk, not because he felt his searing and painful honesty following the death of his wife, Joy, would offend God, but because he feared that if the towering Christian apologist, C.S. Lewis, were known to harbor these thoughts, his Christian brothers and sisters would question the genuineness of his faith. And so he lied in order not to offend his Christian audience. He was right, by the way, as it turned out. After his death, the book was reissued under his own name and deemed by some in the religious community to be offensive to Christianity. However, it might be useful to remind ourselves that the most offensive person in the history of Christianity was Jesus. And those he most offended were the most religious of his day. He broke nearly every cherished rule, perhaps because his followers needed to understand that salvation would not be discerned through rules, but through relationship. All the rules, he said, are fulfilled in love. It's responsive. It's relational. It operates in the here and now. It cannot be reduced to a set of rules. As in, what would Jesus do? Because then it's no longer relational love, but a set of love laws. If we want our artists to fly, we need to teach them to be honest in love, not love laws, but relational love. Love God and do your art honestly. Martin Buber suggests that true art can only happen in relationship. This is the eternal origin of art, he writes, that a human being confronts a form that wants to become a work through him, not a figment of his soul, but something that appears to the soul and demands the soul's creative power. What is required is a deed that a man makes with his whole being. This passage reminds me of a story about Michelangelo. It may be apocryphal, but it's also evocative, so I'll use it. A visiting Prince de Flores came into Michelangelo's studio and found the master staring at an 18-foot block of marble. The artist had come in every day for the last 4 months, staring at the marble, and gone home for his supper. So the prince asked the obvious, "What are you doing?" Michelangelo turned around, looked at him, and whispered, "Sto lavorando." I'm working. 3 years later, that block of marble was the statue of David. His contemporaries called Michelangelo Il Divino, the divine one, because the divine madness spoke so clearly to him from those blocks of marble. This is the essence of a relational approach to art. 2, creativity is a gift from God, not the devil. The preeminent artist in the universe is the great creator. God, out of his abundant creativity, brought the universe into being. Moreover, we're told in Genesis that human beings are the crown of that great work, created in the image and likeness of God. If we accept this, then we should recognize that the creative impulse in humans is a quintessential part of being God's self-portrait. Of course, God created ex nihilo, and we can't do that. We create from what we've experienced. a rearrangement of reality using our imaginations. J.R.R. Tolkien called this process subcreation, like God, but without his infinite capabilities. Yet too often we tell our young artists that the creative imagination has been too irreparably stained by the fall to be indulged, or worse, that it's a diabolical gift, if such a thing were possible. We cite Paul's letter to the Corinthians, that we should cast down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bring into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. We infer from this that even though our imaginations were created innocent, they have since been irreparably corrupted by the stain of the fall. That the same deception that wheedled its way into the minds of Adam and Eve has, like a Trojan horse virus, taken up residence in our own imaginations, lying perhaps dormant, waiting for the moment to open its belly and disgorge its corruption on all we think and do. But the Bible also tells us that the greatest artist of antiquity was the sweet Psalmist of Israel, the warrior, poet, and musician King David, who was a man after God's own heart. Like no other, David pours his authentic pain into his poems. What could be more honest than, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Was this the right message? Probably not, because thus saith the Lord, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." But David's is the cry of an honest heart. I speculate this kind of honesty was precisely why he was a man after God's own heart. Number 3, Christianity is not a genre. We need to stop describing the works of art as Christian, such as Christian films, Christian novels, Christian plays, Christian whatever else we want to say. There is no such thing as a Christian novel, any more than there are Christian drain pipes, Christian cabinets, Christian stethoscopes. There are well-written novels and there are poorly written novels. Excuse me. I'm turning the wrong page. There are well-written novels, there are poorly written novels, and a whole range in between, any of which may be written by Christians. Describing a novel as Christian is a marketing scheme. A Christian novel will more than likely be relegated to a certain section of the bookstore where only the faithful trod. Those who purchase the Christian novel will almost universally do so because they believe the genre tag represents a tacit agreement between the publisher and themselves that ensures their worldview will not be deeply challenged. They will most likely not feel offended by the material. They will be marginally entertained, perhaps somewhat distracted, made to feel what they might call uplifted for a while by its content. In other words, believers label the Christian novel as such because it is deemed safe for consumption. But what precisely is it that makes a novel Christian? Is it that it is written by a believer in Christ? That it promotes Christian themes, however we define those? Or that it is free of a list of banned offensive words, portrays no sexual activity, or very little sexual innuendo? Or that it ends with the right side obtaining victory and the wrong side receiving their just punishments? By these definitions, Harry Potter novels are all Christian. And what makes a Christian film Christian? Is it that it has Christian actors? That all Denzel Washington films are Christian films? Unfortunately, we've become far too comfortable with our faith being merchandised. If being a Christian is marked by a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, then perhaps we should reconsider our exclusionary practices when it comes to categorizing our brothers and sisters in the arts and restricting them based on those arbitrary categorizations. 4, we need to stop trying to dissuade creative children from the arts. If a child is gifted in one field, why try to coerce them into a field they will probably not be particularly skilled at, or worse, never fulfilled in? David in the Psalms tells us to delight in the Lord and he will give us the desires of our hearts. Why then are we so ready to tell our young that those desires of their hearts should be? Why don't we trust that God has planted the seed? I would like to think it's a benevolent, protective impulse based on some misconception balloons that should be punctured, such as artistic careers are direct paths to poverty. Artistic professions are no more populated with derelicts and divas than any other. In fact, careers in the arts are, by and large, working-class professions. Most committed artists work far more than 40 hours a week,
keep regular hours, perhaps not 9 to 5, but regular nonetheless, and are thoroughly devoted to their work. However, artists may, by general standards, mature more slowly than parents would like. I say by general standards because I think the judgment's arbitrary. Any profession has a learning curve. A carpenter begins as an apprentice, then a journeyman, then with years of work, a master. An academic doesn't start out a full professor, but a lowly instructor. A lawyer doesn't begin as a full partner. A doctor starts as an intern. We expect that in most professions. But if an artist isn't fully formed 3 months out of college, they're told to consider their fallback professions. Why is that? What's the fallback profession for a doctor? I was talking with a man not long ago, a doctor by the way, who told me his son had gone to law school, finished successfully, and passed the bar, only to realize that what he really wanted to do was wood carving. The amazing thing here is that his father had the wisdom and foresight to encourage him to go for it. He's a successful wood carver today. And though he may not earn as much as a full partner in a law firm, he makes a comfortable living and is fulfilled by his work. But I suspect most parents would see this as an abject failure if it were their own child, because we measure success by the wrong standards. 5, artists are not necessarily evangelists. This is, of course, one of the most challenging points in an evangelical community, where everything we do must somehow be consciously fulfilling the Great Commission. Referencing Thomas Aquinas, Flannery O'Connor argues that an artist is, first of all, a person who has been given a talent to do a particular thing, and that art does not require rectitude of the appetite, that it is wholly concerned with the good of that which is made. A work of art is a good in itself, and this is a truth that the modern world has largely forgotten. We are not content to stay within our limitations and make something that is simply good in and by itself. Now we want to make something that will have some utilitarian value. Yet what is good in itself glorifies God because it reflects God. The artist has his hands full and does his duty if he attends to his art. He can safely leave evangelizing to the evangelists. But most evangelicals who are artists have been taught at some point that their witness, that is, their art, must somehow be made explicitly useful to God, meaning that it should, at its core, have a message that clearly points to Christ. I think to insist on this explicitly evangelical utilitarianism is to reduce an artist to a propagandist and to ignore God's infinite ability to use him or her for his purposes. It might be useful to remember that the honest cry of the heart may be more truly evangelical than any correct message could be. As with David's cry, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart?" It was the Apostle Paul who wrote, "The body has many members, and not all members have the same function." Within the body of Christ, being an evangelist is one of those functions. But so too, I would argue, is being an artist. O'Connor's point is that our gifts, our talents, our callings are from God, and we should develop those talents, and in doing so, we glorify Him. For the greatest thanksgiving for a gift from God is simply using it to the fullest of our abilities. 6, the notion of the sacred and profane in the arts is a false dichotomy. As Christians, so much of our perception is filtered through a set of irreducible dualistic dyads. We need to stop programming these disjunctive moral dyads into our young artists. I've seen too many young people who feel compelled to make a false choice, being an artist or being a Christian, as though they'd been convinced the two were mutually exclusive. I had a student once who said she wanted more than anything to be an actor, but her father wouldn't let her because he said she'd end up naked on a billboard, as though there were no other choices. That particular student chose a major she wasn't very interested in, but one that pleased her parents. She became a teacher instead, fulfilling George Bernard Shaw's arrogant little dictum, "He who can does, he who cannot teaches." I hope she's fulfilled as a teacher. At least, to my knowledge, she never ended up naked on a billboard. She also chose not to pursue her dream. and perhaps God's call on her life because her parents saw her creative gifts as profane. She obeyed her dad but suppressed her father. But perhaps more troubling are those who actually pursue the dream in the face of sometimes fierce opposition and frame that pursuit in their own minds as an act of rebellion against a system they recognize as too rigid to embrace them. Is it really our desire to alienate creative people? We either alienate them from themselves by telling them they must suffocate their creativity, or we alienate them from the body of Christ by inferring there's no function for them unless they toe the line within the sacred demands of the collective. We should end this well-intended ostracizing. We need rather to embrace our artists just as we embrace our doctors, our entrepreneurs, our preachers, our lawyers. Well, maybe not that last one. Moreover, we need to encourage them in a truthful manner. If a young person is skilled in mathematics, we praise them unreservedly. We thereby reinforce the pleasure they gain from performing that skill. We would probably do the same for a child skilled in science or engineering or reading or logic. Why, when it comes to the arts, do we qualify that praise? Kids aren't stupid. They know when they're being encouraged and they know when they're being unencouraged, but they don't always know why. If praise isn't given for their artistic talents, they assume they're no good and get the message that they should not keep trying. Either that, or they perceive that they need to rebel against the repressive system that unencourages them. They develop an either-or mentality when it comes to their artistic calling. Either I can be an artist or I can be a Christian. I can't be both. So even though we might be saying with our mouths, "Fly, little birds, fly," if our unseen hands are all the while plucking out their feathers, we have sealed our children's fate. So I think for our purposes, we need to define art as neither sacred nor profane, but an honest process in which technical skill, ours, combines with ingenio to produce a thing of beauty. For the artist, I think beauty is whatever celebrates our human perceptions of the universe and our place in it. This beauty can be gentle or terrible or many shades between, and all of them, not all of them, are safe. A volcano has a terrible beauty, but it can also be incredibly dangerous. 7. My last point today is that everyone needs encouragement, even artists. And they need it from people who understand, people who have been there. Artists who are Christians may need this more than others, not because they're weaker than others, but because they are often criticized from all sides. From those who say they cannot be real artists because they're Christians, all the way to those who say they cannot be real Christians because they're artists. These communities need not be particularly large, but they should be geographical. And most importantly, they should be critical, but they must be non-censoring. We need these communities because it's essential to have a support system, not a set of prison guards. We need communities of Christians who understand the need for complete honesty and artistic expression. Now let me point out that there's a difference between censoring and critiquing. The former takes place before the production of the art, the latter afterwards. What we need to develop in these communities is encouragement and critique that is neither provincial nor dogmatic, but based on the honest response to the honest artistic quality of the work. It is, for instance, constructive to say, "I don't like that painting." However, it is not constructive to say, "God will not like that painting." It is constructive to say, "That novel is very honest. A Christian publisher will probably never publish it." It is not constructive to say, "You can't call yourself a Christian and leave those bad words in your novel." It is constructive to say, "Your film should probably come with a warning so young people don't see it." It is not constructive to say, "You need to edit out that nudity. It sends the wrong message." Artist communities can provide this kind of constructive criticism while still encouraging the creative process. So, since my time is gone with these few ideas I've been mulling over in recent years, there may be others, but I think these are challenging enough going forward. Therefore, I will end with a quote by a local radical and try to answer any questions you might have.